Welcome to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is a show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guests today are Wayne Van Loon, Principal, and Caitlin Poliak, Associate with Soderstrom Architects in Portland, Oregon. Wayne is a principal at Soderstrom with over 15 years of experience in the programming and design of wineries along the West Coast. In his role as principal, Wayne collaborates closely with owners to translate their vision and production needs into an efficient and elegant design. Prior to practicing architecture, Wayne spent 10 years working for a small family winery in the Willamette Valley and several years owning and operating a hard cidery in Northern California. His experience in all aspects of the industry, from production to marketing, gives him a deep understanding of winemakers' needs and allows him to serve as a liaison between the worlds of wine and architecture. Caitlin, an associate at Soderstrom and a lead accredited professional with 11 years of architectural expertise, has been an integral part of Soderstrom's wine and spirits studio for the past 5 years. As project manager, she has delivered outstanding projects to clients including Abbott Claim Winery, Portland Wine Company, and Freeland Spirits. Her most recent accomplishment is the Echolands Winery. You guessed it, the project we will be talking about today is the Echolands Winery in Walla Walla, Washington. Born from a vision by founder Doug Frost and chairman Brad Bergman and designed in collaboration with Soderstrom Architects, Echolands Winery seamlessly merges architectural splendor with operational prowess. Production facilities will debut with a 27,000 square foot winemaking facility and feature a spectacular hospitality center centered around a public tasting room, cantilevered over the winery grounds and outfitted with glass walls that offer a breathtaking view of the Blue Mountains. Now let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed, as we have just launched our 2024 season. My honored guests today, are Wayne Van Loon, Principal, and Caitlin Poliak. Did I say that right, Caitlin?
You got it. Perfect.
Yes! Score! Associate at Soderstrom Architects in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. Soderstrom is a long-time, well-respected firm in our city, so I am extra excited to have them in the house today. The project that we get to chat about today is the Echolands Winery in Walla Walla, Washington. I was kind enough to send them a picture of my grape stomping adventures, so they're probably traumatized. Wayne and Caitlin, welcome to Detailed. How are you today?
Great. Hi, Cherise. First off, thanks for inviting us. We're very excited to share some information about our projects and speak with you about it. Doing great. Really excited about this.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having us. Really honored to be here.
This is a lot better way to spend a lunch hour on a Friday than a meeting or a lot of other things we could all be doing right now. So I start each podcast with an icebreaker question, and it's different for everybody. Like, if you could be any animal, what could you be? But I was particularly fascinated with some of your bio stuff I read. So, Wayne, you spent 10 years working for a small family winery and several years owning and operating a hard cidery, which I think is just cool as hell. Caitlin, you're listed as an integral part of Soderstrom's wine and spirits studio. Okay, there's another new one for me. I have never been exposed to any architecture firm that has a wine and spirits studio. I want to come visit yours now. So I have to ask, what's your favorite wine and why?
Ooh, tough question.
I knew you would say that first.
So many wines to love out there. Actually, I'll give you kind of an odd response. I'm really into, I'm not going to say cheap, I'm going to say inexpensive wines. And here's the thought behind this. It seems to me that you can always spend a lot of money and get a really wonderful bottle of wine, but it takes a rather astute palate to find wonderful wines that aren't overpriced and very interesting. Beyond that, I would say I always enjoy having wines from our clients. I feel like in our role designing wineries and distilleries, we're somehow part of the process. Like we're part of the team. We help them make the product that they make. And I would add to that a lot of people assume that wineries are just rolling in dough and it's an easy business. It's a really hard business. These businesses have huge capital outlay and they work really hard to make a living. So we're always happy to support them by buying their products.
How about you, Caitlin?
Well, I have a little background story. So the first time I traveled to Walla Walla, when I started out on the Echolands project, we had a big dinner with all of our clients. And one of the owners of the project, Doug Frost, is a master sommelier, a master of wine, and he kept ordering bottles and bottles of wine for the table, all these different types. Everything was great, but the one that really stuck with me that I hadn't had before, he ordered Lambrusco, an Italian wine that's like a lighter red and a little bit sparkling, and it's just really unusual. And I've been regularly buying those ever since. It's just drinks really easy, nothing too fancy. They're usually pretty inexpensive, but it's been a new favorite for me.
And I have to say, I am so jealous.
You are.
I want to add as well that your comment about it's unusual to have a wine and spirits studio with it. Absolutely true. It goes without saying that folks who work in other studios really want to join our team. So there you go.
Well, I'm kind of sitting over here going, do you need an assistant?
Yeah, right.
I'll run over after work and do whatever. It sounds like it would be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So I've seen the area that this winery is in. It's beautiful country as well. So let's start with a little background or history on this project. What was the client's mission and goals, when you first sat down, and what is it they were trying to achieve?
Oh, great question. So a little background here. The ownership group is out of Kansas City, and they've been involved in the wine industry for a while. I believe they have 2 wineries out in their area. And essentially, they fell in love with the Walla Walla region for good reason. It's beautiful. The wines that are made there are stunningly good wines. They felt that it was time for them to move into not only the region, but make an attempt at making world-class, 100-point, top-tier wines. So several years ago, they started to develop their brand. They did this by acquiring some vineyard property and making wines essentially in other wineries. And they got to the point where this brand was gaining traction, getting more grapes. They really wanted to go to that next level. And when we were approached, it was their desire to take this new brand, put it on the map, and not only put it on the map, but put it right on top of the conversation for what's happening in the Walla Walla Valley and Eastern Washington wines. So they wanted a brand presence. They wanted this facility to be a landmark for the area. So you can imagine how excited we were when we were approached with this idea.
Well, and I can't believe I didn't put this on my question list because it just occurred to me now, and it's like, how'd you miss that, Cherise? Your background, your family winery background and the cidery background has to be a game changer in working with any client who wants to do a winery. Because you can speak their language. You know what they're talking about. And
I'll tell you, anecdotally, the reason I am where I am doing what I am has a lot to do, obviously, with the 10 years that I worked in the wine industry. Part of it is I love the wine industry. I love architecture. I'm the lucky guy who was able to take 2 things that I love and piece them together. Incredibly exciting. But part of this also is in response to the years that I spent in the wine industry and wanting desperately to make winemaking facilities not only beautiful, but incredibly efficient. The process of making wine is incredibly hard work. Yeah, it's a lot of fun, but during harvest, you're working long hours, incredibly physical work. Fatigue is an issue. Anything you can do to make that process more efficient, more enjoyable, only, leads to happier people making better wine. So, and when it comes time to work with a client, it is my trump card. The fact that I can sit down early on in the process and speak winemaking, sit across the table with a winemaker and talk about all the intricacies of how they want to make wine and be able to translate those ideas into space planning and eventually into a beautiful building.
That's a ginormous trump card.
Thank you.
Like I would, if I were a winemaker and sitting down to talk to you, that would be the end of the story. I wouldn't be talking to anybody else. I mean, because that's a whole different level of understanding, which is only going to result in a more amazing facility because they know you understand what they need. And, we know in this business, we don't always have the opportunity to be neck deep in whatever type of building. I mean, how it's actually used. We learn a lot about it, but that's not the same as having lived it. So yeah, every winery in the country hopefully is going to call you after this episode now. Hey, we want to talk to you. I know I would if I was listening. So before we get into specific details about different pieces and parts of the project, how about giving me just an overall broad description of this building, what types of spaces, just, if I closed my eyes, describe to me what I'm going to see.
I can speak to that. So the initial directive from the owners was they really wanted the production spaces and the hospitality spaces to be combined in one facility. They really wanted a connection between those. The direct to consumer sales is a growing importance to wineries. So having the hospitality, the tasting room on the same property and being able to have that connection from the consumers to the winemaking really helps them. So they wanted them in the same building. They did want them on separate levels from each other, but have a visual connection and overlook, I think, is the direction they gave. They also this property is so stunning. They wanted us to be able to take full advantage of the views. You can see the Blue Mountains to the south. We're partially up on a hillside. So the way we translated that, we ended up with two primary volumes. One is the crush pad and fermentation room. And then at an angle to that, we have the tasting room above barrel cellars. And the tasting room kind of rises up, is partially cantilevered out, and is just basically a glass box that opens up to the views. There's amazing views in all directions, honestly. So having that connection was really critical. The production spaces are about 20,000 square feet, and then the hospitality spaces are a little over 5,000. So, 25% of the scale, but also primary importance. So we have the main fermentation spaces. We have 3 separate barrel cellars, one of which is on full view to the hospitality.
I have to say, when I looked at the pictures, I have 5 girlfriends I grew up with since we were little girls. And one of our favorite things, and we all live here in Portland, so one of our favorite things to do is let's hit the wineries.
Right.
And we'll go to one area or another, around in the general vicinity and, go wine tasting. And that location and that view and that vibe is so much a part of that experience. I've been to some that are just little tiny places. They got a couple tables outside, and while the wine is great, it's not as much of an experience.
It's funny, Cherise, because we've been in the business for a while, designing wineries, and there's been a serious transition. Back in the early days, we would have clients come to us and really want a facility, and their first questions were about the production end of things. And then it was, oh gosh, and by the way, perhaps we'll put some sort of a tasting room out in the corner there so we can sell some wine. That conversation has completely flipped. I think in part, it's because the wine industry is increasingly competitive. And so what brands and producers are discovering is that connection, that experience is one of the most valuable things that they have. And their goal then is to bring people onto the site to be able to share their wines and tell their story. So now the phone rings, and the first question is, hey, how do we do an amazing, landmark facility that has an excellent hospitality experience? And by the way, we'd also like to have this wonderfully efficient winery integrated into that. So it's a lot of fun.
I'm not surprised when we all go, if it's in a beautiful place and it's a nice day, especially if we can we will stay there a really long time. Like we've gone as far as to hiring somebody's kid to be our driver. But it's a part of the experience. I mean, there's this romanticism involved with a winery. It was a lifetime, that silly picture I sent you guys. It's a lifetime goal of mine to stomp grapes. I just had to stomp grapes once in my life. And then I found out that Willamette Valley Vineyards had a grape stomping competition once a year. And I'm like, we're in. And the costumes too? Yes. But it is that user experience of being out there and looking over the vineyards and, kind of sitting above it and seeing things like the mountains that's the first thing that just absolutely caught my heart looking at that building. The first pictures I looked at is, yep, I need to talk to them. I need to know more. Now I need to go to Walla Walla.
Yes, you will.
So I can only imagine, thinking of our listeners who may have no exposure at all to winery design. I can only imagine that there's a host of unique things involved in designing a facility like this. Can you tell me about some of the unique things you got to design in this building that most of us don't ever get to do?
Sure. I'll lead in. Let's go back to just the basic principles of winemaking and why this matters. So as you bring grapes into the building and you begin fermenting those grapes, those that you may have smashed with your feet, Cherise, carbon dioxide is a byproduct of that natural fermentation. Carbon dioxide at high concentration is toxic. Basically, you suffocate if you have too much CO2 in the air. Carbon dioxide is heavy, so it's rising out of the fermenters. It falls onto the floor in the fermentation room, and with time begins to pool and potentially reach that dangerous level. So part of the fun stuff that we design are systems, which oddly enough are not currently mandated, but these are systems meant to provide safeguards against too much CO2 forming in the spaces. So it's kind of a technical, not very interesting piece of the pie, and something that we need to integrate into what is an otherwise really elegant, beautiful space. And so we go to the trouble of calculating how much airflow movement is required to essentially evacuate the entire contents of the room in 15 minutes. And, so we have exhaust fans that we're thinking about where they go. And then the flip side of that is we also need to have fresh air intake to accomplish that efficiently. And so we'll do some really clever things like have operable windows, or in this case, operable skylights that bring in fresh, natural air and evacuate the spaces. Not the sort of thing you would ever know is in place, but incredibly important to a well-designed winery.
Wow. So I spent a lot of time in wineries. I didn't know anything about that. I didn't even know that was, and a son in the spirits industry, and I didn't even know that was a thing. He's got a degree in fermentation. That's really interesting. So anybody out there who gets a winery job, you better make sure that you have those systems in place, because we want to keep people alive. That's a good thing.
Absolutely. I'm afraid to say that in the wine industry, there are fatalities that occur on a fairly regular basis due to this issue. So it's something that, I don't know that that we insist upon putting these systems in, but, we definitely promote it. And I have to say owners across the board are receptive to this. They really do want to make a safe working environment. So it's kind of an odd thing for us to focus on, but it's really part of the design.
Yeah, but that's a very unique thing that somebody might not even think about. I certainly didn't. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Is there anything else, Caitlin, you'd like to add, and unique features that you have to, or unique things you have to think about in a winery?
One element of this building that is not always present in wineries, but we have done several, is the wine library, which is where the winery will store all their past vintages. And often they have that as like a showpiece space where they can really put all their older wines on display, maybe have private groups, special types of VIP guests taste in there. So in this facility, we were able to actually put that space underground. It's the only like fully below grade part of this building. So it's built as this kind of cave element. You have to go down from the tasting room 2 flights down. It's under the building. And when they were excavating that space, they dug up a ton of basalt that was naturally occurring on the site. So we were able to bring some of that back in. The back wall of the room has a feature wall with basalt, some of which is from that exact space that it was excavated from. And that'll be a really special space for guests to come in and really experience their full range of wines and have a unique tasting experience.
I saw the picture or the rendering, and it was just like, oh, that's cool. That's really cool. Where am I at? So let's start getting real specific about the design of the building. Let's start with the site. Were there any unique challenges? Obviously, you had some basalt, so we know that much. Any unique challenges with this particular site that you had to deal with in order to prepare to start building this winery?
Yeah, I've got an odd sort of take on that. Basically, this is a true greenfield project. The site is 343 acres, I think. It's a massive, beautiful site, rolling hills. When we came to it, it was being farmed for wheat. So you walk up to the site, you're there with the ownership team, and you're staring across 300 some odd acres and wondering where you're going to place a winery. Sounds like a dream come true, and it is, but what a challenge. It's, you have to go through this process of saying no to so much of that beautiful territory and come to a place and stick a stake in the ground and say, this is where we're going to do it. It's an odd response. It's an odd challenge. Never really think about it. You always dream of having this opportunity, but there's a lot of weight in this. So once we came to a general idea of where we wanted the winery, not only for the way the building would be integrated into the site, but the way you would interact with the building as you arrive, then we had to think a little bit more closely about the view shed. And it's an important part of this project. In our case, we had a lot of great things to work with. We had a beautiful view of the valley below. We have a view of the Blue Mountains. And unfortunately, immediately below the property, we have neighbors who have a poorly maintained property. So we had to work with basically sliding the building fore and aft on this particular hillside enough so that we would capture the beautiful views without having a direct line of sight to the property below. Surprisingly challenging. But I think we nailed it.
I think that's a good note to think about on any project where, views are really important to, really you go out and stand there or get up on, something, because you're like your outside deck is elevated. Get yourself up to that level and see what you're going to see if at the level that your deck would be at, because that might be different than what you see when you're standing on the ground.
Sure.
In your project description, I saw both the underground wine library, which I think is really cool. But another bucket list item for me is checking out the whiskey library in Portland, and the primary barrel cellar, strategically integrated into the hillside.
Yeah.
So there's quite a bit of site stuff, because we're still talking about site work. Quite a bit of site stuff going on there. Tell me a little bit more about that. And what challenges do you face when you go stick something in the side of a hill? We know you find basalt when you start digging in certain places.
Indeed. Yeah, so back up and there's a great amount of effort in digging essentially part of the project into the hillside. So there's quite a bit of cost. The reason for that in the case of the winemaking processes is it's beneficial to wines as they're aging in barrel to be in a cool, consistently warm and cool space, I guess. How would I rephrase that? Consistent temperature in those spaces. So by digging into the hillside, you basically inherit those properties. So that's an excellent move for the barrel cellar. Obviously, as you're digging into the hillside, you're exposing yourself to all the water running down that site. And so every time we go into this process, we know that we're creating the ideal environment for a barrel cellar. And we're also exposing ourselves to great amounts of hydrostatic pressure. The waterproofing details around that entire bathtub that we're sliding into the hillside are critically important. It's something we spend a lot of time on, oftentimes before we begin into the waterproofing. We'll have an on-site meeting with the waterproofing team. We'll get mock-ups. We want to see every inch of this system, and the way that things overlap is going to put everyone into a position where we have a watertight facility. It's a lot of work. It's an exposure to risk, but it's really, really beneficial to the project.
I have to say, as a spec writer, my brain went down the rabbit hole of, okay, now you're putting materials up against dirt and moisture, and there must have been some real serious, which you've just explained, some of that is the serious thought into what materials you were going to use and how are they going to hold up in that environment. I mean, working now in building science, leaks, water leaks, air leaks, any of that is like all that ever matters all the time. Did you have to use special products? Things that you might not normally use?
No,
on a regular building?
Yeah, actually, the products in question are nothing particularly special. I think, as they say, the devil is in the details. It's one thing to say we want to use a particular system, we want to use a particular product. It's really, okay, now let's go and actually look at how this is going to be applied. Because every time you have one product interacting with another, or you have a joint, or you're overlapping, you just have to get it right. There's no value in putting anything down there unless those details are addressed from the onset. That's a bit of effort early on. You have to get the whole team sort of understanding the value of it, but it pays huge dividends. When it's done right, we walk away from that building. We know we've got an excellent system that's going to last and perform.
One thing that was interesting to me, we work so mumuch in the Willamette Valley where water is our primary concern. This project being in Eastern Washington, we kept hearing from the contractor, yeah, there's some rain, but this is a much drier environment. We have a lot of concerns about freeze-thaw conditions, snow loads. It was something less common that I hadn't really addressed before. So we had some different conditions that we had to deal with. And also to go back to the added cost of excavating and digging your barrel cellars in. Yes, there's more upfront costs, but in the end, you're going to reduce your HVAC loads on those spaces because they're more naturally just going to maintain the optimal temperature in there. So over the long run, it's really so beneficial to the environment.
Well, and more sustainable. Yeah, definitely. Let's start talking about the building. I always have to ask about the enclosure because that's what I do in my day job. Tell me a little bit about your enclosure design and what that looks like and what, local conditions, you just started talking about that a little bit, snow loads, things, putting that wine, they opened a new one up the street from me, Amatera Winery, not too long ago. That's right down the road from me, which is lovely. Obviously that winery is going to have different things you need to think about with their enclosure than when you get out to Walla Walla, where there's bigger winters and hotter summers. So tell me about the enclosure, tell me about your, wall assemblies and your enclosure and what you chose.
So our primary wall assembly, which is something that we've used a lot in wineries, it's really optimal, is a tilt-up concrete sandwich panel. So the interior structural wide is 7 inches of concrete, 2 inches of XPS insulation, and then the exterior 3 inches of architectural wide. So it can go up quickly. It's all tilted up. It has that thermal mass. It has the insulation that's adequate for the production facilities, which are not fully conditioned spaces. They're just freeze protected primarily. And it also provides just a complete wet wash down environment on the interior. Wineries are essentially exterior spaces in some ways. They're messy. They're getting washed down constantly. They really need to perform as a wet space. Do you want
What's your cladding on the building? I don't have my pictures. Usually
There's
have
no cladding, so it's just the tilt-up concrete. And we used an integral dye on the exterior wide to kind of bring a little more interest. And then we have the 2 primary volumes. In between, there's a lower roof, and on those walls, we did a board form texture to mix it up a little, but it is all tilt-up concrete. And then on the fully conditioned spaces, the offices, the tasting room spaces, we then furred out to the interior to add additional insulation and a different interior finish.
Yeah, I would rather not freeze to death when I'm drinking wine. So I loved it when I saw this. I understand this project includes a mass timber roof structure because we're so cool in the Pacific Northwest. Right. We're hearing a lot about mass timber these days with a planted living roof. Mm. So anybody who's listened to more than one episode of this podcast has probably run across one of the episodes where I'm saying I hate writing specs for green roofs. There's so many layers involved and so many ways you can really, really mess it up if you don't get it right. So I'm always kind of fascinated every time somebody's got, a living roof, like, tell me about that. I want to know. So tell me in a little more detail, get technical if you like, about this structure, this mass timber structure and this planted living roof, and what kinds of considerations did you have that you had to think about, and how many people were involved to get all of that to come together?
Well, I want to start off by saying that the areas where we have plantings on the roof weren't originally envisioned for such. So out of the gate, we didn't have that in our concept. It was something that we knew was a possibility. So we kind of had to sort of shift gears mid-design to be able to accommodate that. It makes a lot of sense. It's a beautiful part of the facility, but it was one of those pivot points we had to make in the project.
And to that end, it's not a true living roof. It is a membrane roof. And then above that, we've built up a pedestal system with the pavers for the occupiable roof deck, and integrated into that are modular planters. So those are actually up above, raised up above the membrane roof. Everything drains down below. They're on trays, but there's going to be large areas of plantings, but it's not a true living roof in that sense. So it was a little easier to specify.
I'm listening to you going, oh, that's a really good way to get that green up there and not have to do that actual living roof, which and this is just in my humble opinion, please nobody slay me, but living roofs can be problematic, besides the fact that if you don't get everything just right, you have problems if they're not maintained. I've seen so many living roofs where they probably looked really great on day one, but they look like an overgrown field.
Yeah.
Later on down the road. So I think that is something, a really thoughtful decision has to be made before you do that. I think it's part of the reason I'm seeing less of that these days.
Absolutely.
Because I think the owners are realizing both the potential issues with your roofing system if everything isn't perfect, and the maintenance or things they don't want to take on. But when it's
Yeah.
done right, they're gorgeous. But you guys look like you just solved the problem.
We kind of dodged that bullet. I mean, we still took on a lot of weight under the roof assembly. And again, this occurred sort of mid-design. And so we found ourselves having to work back below that assembly to add considerably more structural support and deal with the ramifications of clearances for the spaces below. So not optimal, but all said and done, we got the living roof, or the planters, I should say, and preserved the design of the spaces below.
And one interesting aspect of that is that the landscaping is all going to be done by the owner's team. One of the owner's brothers actually is a landscape architect, so he's taking on specifying all the plantings, and that's going to be happening a little after the fact. So we really had to very carefully indicate what the maximum saturated weight for those planters could be in terms of the growing medium. So even though contractor's not installing that, we laid it out very clearly for the owner to come in, and the structural load was based on that. So we've had to make sure we communicate all the requirements to them to make sure we're not overloading that roof.
Did that weight on the roof, because we all know a lot of weight on a roof is a big deal. Did that weight on the roof influence your decision to do that mass timber structure, or what made you choose that?
No, actually, that is the lower in-between roof, so that had the structure below. The mass timber structure is the two main volumes that have a low-sloped roof, glulam beams, and then CLT decking. The CLT I hadn't worked with before. This is my first project using that. Our structural engineers at DCI suggested it for this condition. They thought it would perform well, that it would give kind of a unique quality to really accentuate the raw materials. We have concrete, we have wood, we have steel. We're not trying to cover up the roof. We want to reveal it and have it be a beautiful part of the space. And it also, because they come in such large panels, it was a kind of a time and cost saving measure for the contractor to do that.
So I'm going to throw you a curveball.
Yeah.
So I just get excited every time somebody says, this is the first time because it's like there's lessons learned in every project we do. I mean, period. That if you think you know it all in this business, you need to retire or get out. Because you're going to learn. I've been doing this a long time, and I feel like I know less every day when I wake up than I did the day before, because things are changing. And so your first time working with CLT, what did you learn from that and getting to know CLT, and what you needed to do that will make the next winery project you work on go more smoothly, because you know it now and you didn't before because you'd never worked with it?
That's a great question. Things that are coming to mind are the openings. So we do have 3 skylights in the fermentation space in the CLT roof. So really dialing in those dimensions really carefully with the skylight dimensions, because you can't adjust the opening in that CLT roof once it's delivered on site. It has to work with the skylight dimensions. So paying super close attention to that. And then the flashing details on that roof were something we spent a lot of time with. We also ended up with a insulated panel roof system, a king seam roof, which was not the initial plan. We were going to build up above the CLT insulation where standard standing seam roof. And part of that was we wanted to be able to conceal all the electrical conduit of the CLT, run it in the insulation layer. But as part of a VE process, the contractor recommended these insulated roof panels, which again, I had not worked with before. So first time with those. And, that saved quite a bit of money. Again, came in these large panels that were able to be assembled on site very quickly. And in the end was a great choice for this building. But then we did end up with conduit below the CLT. We had to work closely with the electrician to make sure that it looked intentional, was laid out kind of behind the glulam beams, and just worked with the building design.
And I want to add something else. Likewise, I had worked with CLT. And one of the things that we had contemplated early on and sort of decided, well, we'll get to that in time, is how we were going to seal up and stain or finish that exposed side of the CLT. Seems fairly straightforward, except for the fact that the CLT basically spans an interior condition and an exterior. And the amount of time we spent trying to get the right sealant coating on that CLT to perform well and then handle different conditions interior to exterior was significant. So much so that we ended up having to source a product in Canada. It's the
Samson.
Thank you.
The manufacturer. It's a precision coat is the product. And the owner also, so the mass timber roof is all Doug fir. The owner did not want it to get orangey, kind of yellow and orange over time, as we know Doug fir can do. So we wanted a product that would protect against UV and maintain the tone of the Doug fir that we wanted to reveal, not cover up, but not orange out. So it definitely took some time to dial that in. We had quite a few samples, a lot of conversations with the manufacturer to get that in place.
But look at all the weapons you have in your arsenal on the next one. I know exactly what we need. That was, I loved every bit of that answer. That was just packed with one good piece of advice after another, and things to think about even for people doing other types of projects that might have conditions that could be similar. Just great stuff to think about. So let's move inside the building for a minute, into some of the interior spaces. And I want to break them up a little bit because you've got kind of different things going on here. So let's start with the production space. We've talked about it a little bit. I understand that includes a fermentation room, the 3 barrel cellars, a covered crush pad, which I'm going to ask you to tell me what that is because I have no idea what that is, labs, and offices. So tell me a little bit about this production space and some of the things you've got going on in the interiors in these different spaces. And tell me what a crush pad is.
Okay, yeah, let's start in with the crush pad. The crush pad is a magical part of the winery. Essentially, the crush pad is where the fresh grapes are coming into the building. It typically is a covered space. It has a lot of equipment where incoming grapes are initially processed. So the processing is sorting through the grapes to make sure that they're all healthy and sound, using equipment to get the grapes away from the grape stems, and then put all of that together, potentially crushing the grapes instead of stomping on them, and bringing that slurry, which is called must, into the building. So it's really like it's the first step in the winemaking process. And so when we're thinking about a crush pad, we're thinking about very, very critical equipment clearances, the quality of light as you're looking, you're sorting through grapes, you need very high quality light. There are utilities everywhere for all the equipment. You have sloping floors, you have trench drains. It's kind of this chaotic, messy sort of entry into the winemaking process. So for us, that's out on one end of the building. For us, as we contemplate a winery, we do it in part thinking about, obviously, the winemaking process. And for us, it's the grapes arrive, where you get the grapes to the point where it's that slurry, the must that we're going to ferment. It's the process of bringing that into the building. So that means the crush pad is then adjacent to the fermentation room. It finally comes into the building, and the fermentation room is this wonderful space that is lined with tanks. It has catwalks, lots of good quality light, and a lot of room. You need considerable vertical clearance because typically what happens is the grapes coming in are brought in some sort of a vessel, a 4x4 bin of sorts, and by using a forklift, dumped into these fermenters. So the room has this odd set of requirements where it's high ceilings, a broad aisle in the middle of the space so you can drive a forklift around. And again, sloping floors, critical part of the design, and a big print screen down the middle of the space. So that room has its own set of needs. And in this case, we had a very clever solution. A fermentation room doesn't have tanks of all the same size. So as we're working through the early design process, we're working with the winemaker to determine the quantity and size of tanks very early on in the process. And that helps us arrange the tanks in that space. And from that, determine those critical vertical clearances. And Caitlin took that information and developed this beautifully sloping fermentation room, where the lower end of the room has smaller tanks with less vertical clearance, moving out to the other end of the room where the taller tanks, their taller clearances. So it's somewhat the form speaking about the function, which is very nice. And then the other thing that we'll often bring into that fermentation room is some natural light. Oftentimes these rooms, the doors are open, you have skylights, you have, in our case, in this project's case, vertical windows strategically aligned between the tanks so that you're bringing in some natural light. You can almost operate the room without flipping the lights on. And so from that process, from the fermentation room, the next step is to take the wine when it's done and move it over into barrels. And it goes into barrels for aging. There is, in our case, we look at barrel cellars and think about them in terms of where they are in the life of the aging wine. There are initial barrel cellars where incoming wine first goes. It may have unique temperature requirements. So we'll divide the larger barrel storage into smaller spaces. Eventually, the barrels, as they age, are moved along into rooms where they're in more what you might consider long-term storage. And those rooms as well do require sloping floors. They have drains, but they're not as critical as the other areas where you're working with solid grapes and you're making a giant mess, basically. But essentially, as we're chasing the wine through the building, it's grapes to must to finally wine to go in and age, and then it turns around and wants to come back through the building. And so we're thinking about the process of the liquid wine coming back into some of the tanks in the fermentation room and be able to be finished and blended and then prepared for bottling. And then lastly, bottling, in this case, sometimes a winery will have equipment within the building. More often than not these days, they hire a company to come in with a large bottling line on a semi-truck. So it's an interesting point to think about, and that is that wineries, unfortunately, end up, like early on when we're thinking about siting a winery and the processes related to it, we're thinking about things on the scale of a semi-truck. And it's horrible because you have this beautiful site, you have this wonderful building, and then you've got to accommodate massive trucks driving around. But in this case, we have a covered canopy for the bottling truck to pull into, and then the services there so that we can bottle wine directly out of the tanks. So there's it's a process diagram that we work through, and you just chase the arrows through the building as the wine goes through its life and passes through the building, hopefully as efficiently as possible.
I was going to say, I would imagine that would be more efficient. And it sounds like the real true focus on the production facility, maybe outside of the lab and the offices, is functionality. And, I'm guessing you didn't do a whole lot of really cool interiors in the production facility. It's all about making sure you have the right space for the right equipment. You can clean it, because we all know what lovely stains wine can make. Making sure
the critical concern. One thing that we did here on the floor of the fermentation room, it's a concrete floor. Like Wayne said, everything's sloping to drain. There are no flat floors in the production spaces. But we also added an epoxy coating on the floor, which really will protect that concrete much longer term from the acids in wine. So we're able to, it's an added expense, but it was worth it to the owner to do that up front and have much more durable finish on that floor.
That's a genius solution, though, because the first thing I was thinking is, I saw the pictures. I'm thinking, day one, that space is the floors are going to look horrible, because they're going to be all stained.
Yeah, well, more than staining, wine, actually, incoming grapes have a fairly low pH, so high acid. And it's shocking to me when a winery is built with just bare concrete floors. You can come back 10 years later and all of the concrete around the perimeter of the trench drains has been eaten away. And oftentimes the areas right out for the tank has been eaten away by the acids in the wine and the alcohol. So it's definitely, it's an investment early on, but it pays huge dividends in the long-term viability of the space.
And then to go back to your question about some of the support spaces on the production side. So there are offices. One of the more special offices is the winemaker's office, and that we put in a very prominent corner with a lot of visibility. So the winemaker has a window out to the crush pad to be able to really easily observe the activity there, a window into the fermentation space, and is really kind of this central hub. And then across from that, in a similar position, is the lab, which also has a visual connection to those spaces, is where a lot of testing occurs on the wine as it's being developed. And next to the lab is the technical tasting room, which is for the wine production staff, not for visitors, sadly. But the primary concerns there are natural light, so they can really view what the wine is looking like as it's aging and they're testing it. White surfaces, again, it's all about just being able to see your wine, have those conversations about how they want to adjust it before it is finished and bottled.
I have to say, when I was reading about this and listening to you guys talk, and having a son that's a product developer, so he's in the lab all the time at Boston Beer, and working up and testing these things, and they have a sensory tasting area, and so all of these are familiar to me. So I'm not an expert, trust me, but I have to say that I've been to my fair share of wineries, and I've toured my fair share of wineries, and when you said a lab, I was like, have I ever seen a lab in a winery? I'm familiar with it. My son works in one every day. But I was a little surprised when I saw that from the wineries I've been to.
Yeah, they're a hugely important part of the winemaking process. In fact, during harvest, which is typically perhaps 5 to 6 weeks, there's an intense period of time when you are living your life as dictated by grapes. The grapes become ripe. They are ready to be picked. I don't care how tired you are. You're going into the winery. You're going to work. You're going to work for the grapes for a while. And as the grapes come into the winery, there are critical decisions that are being made by the winemaking team. And a lot of those decisions are built off of some basic chemistry that they do on the incoming grapes and juice. And so we always focus on putting that lab, it's almost like the command center during harvest, in proximity to the fermentation room and to the crush pad. It's hard to do sometimes in programming and laying out spaces, but it's such a huge factor that will drive our conversation as we lay out the building. And when we do it right, winemakers are delighted. That's where they are. That's where they need to be. They have everything that they require, and they have good lines of sight throughout the building. So we're on top of that one for sure.
Was there any special, because I'm a little fascinated about that, because I know my son also worked when he was in college at Oregon State. He worked in the labs there testing hops for farmers, hops growers all over the country would send them to Oregon State to get tested because consistency in their beers is a big issue. So they would send in these hops, and if they didn't have all this chemical makeup that matched the last batch of whatever particular beer they were going to make, they might reject that particular, because they go out to farmers, get a baggie full of hops and send them to the lab and help them decide what hops to buy. Is there special equipment is it basic, lab equipment, or was there anything special you had to put in that lab that's really specific
Yeah,
to the
we make
testing they need to do?
yeah, we do make some accommodations. As with all things, the technology has improved considerably. Um, in the early days, you had essentially like a laboratory, beakers and ventilation and all this sort of stuff. As time has gone on, testing equipment is now countertop. Maybe it's 2 feet by 4 feet by. I mean, it's expensive stuff, but that's how the lab has sort of grown into its modern form. So we do accommodate that. There's some basic equipment that they require. It's always good to have some sinks, have some glass washing equipment to keep the labware clean. It's a lot of space. And it's funny because it's almost like it's half lab, half office space, because during harvest, oftentimes the winemaker, assistant winemaker, enologist, any of these roles will be camped out in the lab. So there's space for laptops, and there's good data in there. There's good lighting. And then there are a few accommodations for the lab. And ventilation still remains an important part of that, so we'll design that into that space.
I'm not kidding. I'm going to have to go to Walla Walla now because I want to see it. Let's talk about the elevated tasting room and the hospitality spaces. Obviously, there's going to be a whole different ball game, especially now that you just told me all the things you just told me about the production space. A whole different ball game in what you did for the interiors in those spaces. And so you had the private tasting room, the underground wine library, the elevated tasting room. Talk to me about some of these spaces and what you did to make them that place I don't want to leave for hours.
I can speak to that. So one of the early and major moves we made was elevating that tasting room. And the entry sequence is really important. So the tasting room entry is on a separate side of the building from the production crush pad entry. And it's located kind of at the halfway point elevation-wise between the fermentation floor and the tasting room floor. So you enter into a glassed-in ramp, and you rise up this ramp 7 feet. And as you go up, on your left is the exterior curtain wall overlooking that amazing view that we discussed. And on the right side is also glass overlooking the primary barrel cellar. So that is that big connection between the hospitality space and the production space. Well, they wanted that connection. They don't necessarily want visitors like watching the fermentation room. It's kind of messy and a lot of activity. So having that connection to the barrel cellar is more optimal. It's kind of a quieter space, but still really special, and people love seeing that. So this ramp entry brings you up, and then you kind of compress a little into a hallway, and then it will open up into a large tasting room that's really just a glass box, and really an open, flexible space. The owners wanted it to maintain flexibility. There's really no built-in casework. There's a back bar. One thing that was interesting on this project, one of the owners his main career has been working in hospitality and wine. And he felt really strongly he did not want a traditional tasting bar that separated the service side from the guest side and have that separation. So there's just the back bar. There's no bar that a customer would stand up and talk to someone at. He really wanted it to be more open, engaged, and collaborative. One challenge there for us, though, is all your bar casework and equipment is exposed to the room. So it all has to look nice. There's no backside that's hidden from the public. But that was an interesting request. And I have seen that layout more often. I think it's kind of a new trend in tasting rooms to forego that traditional bar. There's also, aside from the primary tasting room, there's a private tasting room that's kind of tucked back away a little bit. It's screened off from the ramp, so we're able to design this kind of special wood screen. And it also overlooks the barrel cellar and is just a space for them to have more private events. They might have private dinners there. And then both these spaces open up to the roof deck, which is just going to be an amazing outdoor tasting experience. We talked a bit about the deck system, and it's really laid out with these planters and like little nooks between the planters for tables and more private spaces.
And we should talk a little bit more about that elevated tasting room. Early on, the concept was that was going to be a pretty serious cantilever for that space. The sort of marching orders were we wanted to bring people into the building in an interesting, engaging way, get them into that space and have them enjoy a direct connection with the surroundings, with the vineyard, with everything, kind of get the building out of the way. So that means we have this floating glass block, sitting out there at the edge of the building. And of course, that volume in this instance is facing directly south. So we have floor to ceiling curtain wall system exposed to a lot of southern light. And so our solution was, we went round and round trying to select the right glazing system. We did a curtain wall system for this building to pass energy code. Initially, we found that it was a triple pane system. You don't often see. Two panes weren't cutting it. And not only was it a triple pane system, we had low E glazing and slight tints. And there was a fine balance there. We wanted as much as possible for people in that space to have a direct link to the outside areas. And so the darker the tint became, the more effective it was at cutting down solar gain, but the less you felt that direct connection. And forgive me, I'm trying to recall which specific glazing system
the glazing's from Vitro, and it's Optigray coating on the Solar Band 70, I believe, is the glazing system with the low E glazing. And we did have some initial feedback when the contractor was installing this. None of the HVAC systems were in place. There's no cooling yet. This was late summer. It was really hot in Walla Walla. And they said, wow, we're standing in this space fully glazed and I feel comfortable. There's no air conditioning on, but it's really doing its job. So we feel good about that.
That's I'm creating pictures in my brain while you're talking. And I am a little curious about what, it's a glass block or, a glass box. And so, you're not hanging art on the walls. You're not doing things like that. What do the finishes look like in that space?
Yeah.
To give it, some pizzazz, when all your I know your walls, your decorations on your walls are the outdoors, which I'm sure is going to be gorgeous. What did you do with other finishes in that space?
That's a great question. So 3 walls are glass. We do have kind of an interesting approach to the structural system where at every glulam beam we have paired steel columns, so on both sides of the beam. So we have this kind of regular rhythm of the paired columns that comes through to that glass space. And then the north wall is really the only wall that's not glass. So the bar is on that wall. There's a display shelf, but it was also our opportunity to bring in some acoustic control, which is really important. The floors are polished concrete. The walls are glass. The ceiling is wood. So we need to bring in acoustic paneling wherever we can. And we were able to source this very cool textural felt acoustic that we're wrapping that wall and kind of down the hallways a bit. So it has a decorative element, but it hopefully also going to provide that acoustic support for the space.
Yeah, and in general, our directives were to try to stay as true as we can to pure materials expressing the structure. So there is a bit of a balance there between just having a very plain space and being able to introduce the acoustic panels, a carefully chosen wood for the casework. So very subtle things that we were able to do to add to that room without offsetting that balance of a pure expression of just a few materials.
Light fixtures? I don't know why that's popping in my head, but I'm
Yep,
thinking, okay,
yeah.
what can you do in a space with 3 glass walls inside to still give it that personality? And one of the things that popped in my head was light fixtures would
Yeah.
be a way to do that without interfering with that outside view. So anything special you pick there?
That's a great question. So the primary light fixtures in the ramp and the tasting room are more simple. They're ceiling mounted cylinders, but we do have a couple spaces where we did like a special fixture. And one is in one corner of the tasting room is the stairwell. It's an open stairwell. So we have a really special chandelier above that stairwell with these glass globes hanging at various lengths, and that we did this custom pattern with. And then again, in the private tasting room where there's going to be a table, we're able to put in a pretty cool chandelier there as well. So choosing your moments for the kind of the special spaces without it being too overwhelming.
I can tell already, I am a simple is better kind of person in what I find appealing, in or on buildings. I'm not a real fan of super, super busy unless it's something like, the Sistine Chapel where everything's supposed to be super, super busy. And so that simple elegance is my favorite place to sit. It's my favorite place to be because I'm a type A personality. And so my brain's busy all the time. And so the simpler my surroundings are, the better I function.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, Cherise, because Doug Frost, who is the hospitality expert in this project, really spoke a lot about wanting things to not be a distraction from the wine. That's why people are there. And so, again, the building is trying to do its best to support that engagement between the customer, the wine drinker, and the Echolands staff who are telling their story, presenting their project or their product. It's about the wine. So that was definitely one of the directives we were given on the space.
And conversely, it's also about the property and the view.
Sure.
So having that be your main focal point is the view out rather than what's happening within that room.
Well, even sitting in the tasting room, depending on where I'm sitting, I can look and see the barrels. Everything's telling the winery story without it. I've been to wineries where it's like, there's a little much going on here. I love the small little unique places that you walk in and the sommelier is in there and they're ready to tell you every story and every detail you want to know. And that's what that experience is supposed to be. So tell him I said he's a smart dude. Sustainability. Did you guys have any particular, whether you pursued points or anything or not, any particular things that you were really looking at? I imagine a winery uses a lot of water, a lot of energy. Did you look at any particular systems or do particular things to make this building more sustainable in the way that it, has to operate?
Yeah, absolutely. And just as an aside, when we began any conversation with an owner, we basically have a programming questionnaire that we work with. And usually it's like, just the facts. Give us just the facts about what we're up to here in broad terms. That's always one of the questions we touch on early on in design. And more often than not, when we pose the question, would you like to pursue LEED certification? Owners more and more are pulling away from that for the sake of accumulating points and documentation and a plaque on the wall. Rather, they're wanting to discuss, hey, outside of the LEED guidelines, what are the things that we can bring into this project that really makes sense for us? And let's explore every one of those. So in this case, one of those areas, and it's Walla Walla. There's a lot of sunlight. We do have a pretty healthy solar array over the crush pad. Forgive me, I'm trying to recall how large it is. We can get back to you on that.
Well, it is actually sized to provide about 27% of their anticipated electrical load. And then structurally, some of the other roof areas are built for future solar, so they can increase to 100% in the future if they wish.
And then another interesting thing that we do that is a sustainable way to address some of the power requirements for the building. That CO2 evacuation system I was describing previously, in this case, there are exhaust fans, there are operable skylights. We add the ability for the owner to set timers on that system. The idea is that during the middle of summer, when the days are warm but the nights are cool, that system opens up and brings in cool outside air to help cool those spaces down, just out at the environment. Then lastly, perhaps, but water is a huge consideration with the winery. Water, and then also what's called process waste. So everything that's going down those trench drains and off the site, down the hill in this case, is something that we think a lot about. And that's another opportunity for us to give the owner ways to do things in a more sustainable fashion. You want to describe this?
Yeah. So the process waste water system is separate from the septic system. It's its own entity. And in this case, we're using a system that we've used in one other project previously from Biofiltro is the company. And they take that process waste and they put it into these prefab shipping containers, essentially full of worms. And the worms digest that winery waste and they output water to their retention pond. And it's a really cool system. There's a few wineries using that. It's gaining steam. They also provide it for dairy farms, other type of industrial wastewater processing. But it's a fully worm-based process system.
I knew I wanted to do this interview. I'm sitting here. Did she just say worms?
They call them
genius, though.
Big old rooms. It's silly.
My feet don't want to go there. But I did a 6.5-year stint in MEP engineering, writing specs for an MEP firm here in town. And so, that focus for that portion of my career was all on electrical and water reuse and how to make more efficient systems, HVAC systems. And so it's always an area of curiosity because there's so much we can do. And to your point about kind of stepping back a little bit from, pursuing necessarily points in any given sustainability program, I'm hearing that a lot.
Well,
it's not that people are doing less sustainable projects. I'm seeing that people are doing more and more every day.
Yep.
But they're focusing their efforts on not trying to meet a point requirement, but doing the best they can with their systems. So maybe, I don't know if it's still this way with LEED because I haven't done any LEED stuff in a while, but it used to be you could get points for a bike rack. Not being, at this winery out in the middle of all these acres of fields, who wants the bike rack point?
Right.
I know you didn't have to go after that particular point, but I'm hearing that a lot of people are really hyper-focusing on how can I be the most sustainable we can be within this budget without, kind of worrying about those other layers. So that certainly is not uncommon right now.
Now we call that
people are working harder and harder.
Yeah. Well, we call that the common sense approach to sustainability. So what can we really just build in without going to this extra effort? The natural ventilation, the daylighting, dialing in the mechanical systems and trying to reduce the mechanical load, things to that nature that really makes sense for this type of facility.
And worms.
That works.
I want to write a spec section on this equipment just so I can write about worms. I just so did not expect to hear that today. So every project includes lessons learned. We all know that. If we don't, we're in serious trouble.
Yeah.
Whether it's something new you get to tackle you've never done before, we've already talked a little bit about some of those kinds of things, or unexpected design challenges as you're trying to make your design come together, because we're talking about design right now. And, transitions are different things you have to accommodate to make something particularly tight or it's in a unique condition. What would each of you say was your biggest lesson learned from this project?
For me, coordinating the mechanical systems was a huge challenge. It's interesting. We're really used to working in Revit. Everything's in 3D. We have all the structure modeled in 3D. Our mechanical engineer is great, but works in AutoCAD. Everything's 2D. So, we're seeing where the ductwork is going. We're seeing where we modeled the major mechanical equipment, but we didn't necessarily model all the ductwork. And once it's being built, realizing, wow, there's some tight clearances, working out how everything's going to fit together. We had to make some adjustments in the field to that end. So I'm definitely taking away coordinating that a lot earlier on. I'm thinking about those spaces. Mechanical rooms always need to be larger than you think they should on plan. Really focusing on those earlier, I think, will be the big consideration for me in the future.
And I'm just going to step right in there and get myself into trouble. But I really, really dream of a day when our entire consultant team is working in 3D. We put so much effort into building really accurate models of the building. And then we're trying to integrate all of these critical systems into those buildings. And we're trying to translate between 2D and 3D. I just can't wait for the day where we're all working on the same platform. Clash detection would be really wonderful. I know that happens on larger projects, but it really, for the industry, it would be great if all the consultants were on that same page. Tremendously helpful.
So tell me about one thing that occurred during construction that required you to pivot or required you to rework something or order a different material or something that came up that you'll know next time, okay, this piece or this thing we have to think about sooner, or we have to specify something different. What's your favorite story? I don't call them problems because there's no project we go through that doesn't have things you've got to work through.
I'm not sure this one falls exactly in the, the next time this happens category. It could. But on this project, as we've discussed previously, our working relationship with the winemaking team is critical to the success of the project. And in this project, perhaps, how far along were we? We were into construction, really along the way.
About 6 months ago.
Yeah, and the ownership changed the winemaker. Doesn't sound like that's a big thing, but it really is. So the winemaker is brought on board, a new winemaker, and of course we're having conversations again about the way that this building supports winemaking. Winemaker has a completely different idea about how they want to use this facility, and we had to pivot into a whole new set of requirements for the building at construction.
Fairly far along in construction, honestly. And, ultimately we do want our building to be flexible. It is designed for a certain approach to winemaking that was given to us in the initial programming phase, but we want it to be adaptable, be able to adjust over time and really serve them in the long term. So we were able to make those adaptations, but it involved adding a lot more mechanical systems in than we had planned for. The glycol piping went from a 2-pipe system to a 4-pipe system, so just a lot more space on the wall, a lot more coordination to that extent.
And I guess maybe that does really build into lessons learned. And we always try to build in a little bit of room for changes along the way, some flexibility. But looking forward, as much as possible, the flexibility, a bit of room for things to change. It's an attractive notion to have it all dialed in from the onset, and we do, but you want to dial it in and know that there are going to be changes. Some of them you will not ever see coming. This was a big one for us, and I think had we left a bit more room for some of these changes, we would have had an easier time. We went from contemplating the systems in this building foot by foot, 6 inch by 6 inch to inch by inch, half an inch here, half an inch there. And oh my goodness, a lot of extra work went in to accommodate those changes. So I think down the road, we'll leave just that much more room for some changes.
Well, and I also imagine since you had designed some room for changes already in, that it could have been a lot worse had you not already had that built into that flexibility built into your original
It would
site.
have been.
I don't think anybody could see something like that coming, but that had to help ease the process.
Absolutely.
Had we not complete disaster.
Right. Had we not had some room already built in, it would have been everyone put everything down, stop right there. We need to reconsider this whole thing and figure out how to redo this project. You're right. Having some flexibility really helped us. I think I'm just beginning to comprehend maybe that a little bit more is always a good idea.
Great. Less I'd be having a heart attack. Did you want to add something, Caitlin?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the question you had posed about our lessons learned in construction. And yeah, there were a ton of very specific instances, but the big thing that kind of stood out to me in terms of my biggest challenge or what I want to take forward in the future is more interpersonal. And for me, it was like learning how to be the bad guy and to bring up problems confidently, respectfully, but really being able to fight for the owner's needs and make sure that what was built was per the design, what we'd spent so much time on. A lot of women are conditioned as we grow up to be nice, for everyone to like us, to be people pleasers. And I had to fight against that a bit. At first, I was letting Wayne be the bad guy, which
I'm naturally good at that.
But I was able to start to develop some of those skills over time that I think are important.
So before we get to our couple of closing questions, what's next for Soderstrom? What, maybe even specifically your wine and spirits studio, what can I expect to see coming out of Soderstrom going forward that you're working on? Because I'll be calling you back. So you ready to come talk to me again? What's Soderstrom doing now and that we can get excited about?
Sure. We have a couple of things in the hopper. It's worth mentioning that not only do we design wineries, we design distilleries too. Some of the same sort of thought processes and bits of specialization go to that project type. So we have a couple of distillery projects in the works, including that we're consulting on a distillery in Minneapolis, which is quite fun. I would say writ large for the wine and spirits group, we're definitely focused on projects that's similar to Echolands, a project we did recently called Abbott Claim. And it's interesting because those projects, those they're projects that are sort of built by the owners. And by that, I mean, for us to be able to get engaged with the project, have opportunities to do really meaningful design, it is just critical that the ownership team not only gets it, but they're in support of us. And I think part of the reason that we've been so successful on this project is that the ownership team from the onset was really in favor of doing everything well, was invested in a quality outcome. And when we needed them during construction, had our backs. There were times when we would bring an issue to the ownership team and say, look, it doesn't have to go in a particular way, but we feel really strongly for the quality of this project, for the outcome that we're all looking for, that we need the specific thing, and they were there for us. So that's keep your eyes peeled. I think we're going to see more and more high quality winery projects that are led by ownership teams that really want the best outcome, that are willing to push the envelope a bit. That's where we're going.
I have no doubt in my mind that you are going to be wildly successful because trust is everything, right? You're already developing an expertise on having this wine and spirit studio. I want to come to the distilleries, but okay. So this wine and spirit studio, but you can also talk the talk. And I do think that there's a lesson there that owners will have your back. If they trust you and you've built that relationship and they understand, especially wineries, because they're kind of artists as well at heart. And wineries aren't typically billionaires. I have a good friend of mine that I've known for a very long time that married an owner of a winery, and it's a winemaker out here in Sherwood, Oregon. And so, they had their wedding at the farm. I got to go out and see a lot of extra things that maybe the general public wouldn't get to see, but it is a lot of hard work, and there's blood, sweat, and tears in a lot of these, especially smaller wineries, that go into their craft. And so they're putting a lot in your hands because this is their whole world that they're going to be experiencing in this building. It's not just some business they're running. This is their everything, probably a history in their family. And so that trust is everything. And it seems to me, just by listening to both of you, that you put a lot of care and feeding into developing that relationship and letting them know that, yes, we care enough to understand and know what you do. Your background is golden here. So I'm really interested to see what you guys are going to do going forward. And I might just show up one day and say, which wine did you get to try from which winery are you working on? So final questions. I usually do a broad industry question before our final question. So mine for you today is, our buildings are getting more complicated every day, requiring even more knowledge and experience, while our workforce right now is getting younger and younger very quickly. That we have a big generational imbalance going on here. What do you think architecture firms need to be doing to effectively navigate this change in climate in our architecture firms? I mean, the train is hitting the wall is basically what it is. And I started talking about this 20 years ago and everybody ignored me. And now it has hit the wall and we've got work to do. And the experience level of our workforce is different. And so, those of us that are in Gen X, we're tiny. We're half the size of the boomers, plus we lost 24% of people in architecture in 2008 in that recession that never came back. So Gen X is really tiny, and we're supposed to naturally be the next leaders in our firms, but there's not enough of us to do that. What do you think we could be doing better?
Oh, mentorship. I mean, clearly, it used to be it was the lifeblood of the industry. Older professionals took great care to help younger professionals develop their skills. And I think in the last, 15 years, maybe more, that's been something which has maybe had some lip service. I don't think the industry, the profession has invested enough in that. It's something that our firm definitely acknowledges and cares about. It's something that we've built into the way that we operate our firm. I'll add one other odd sort of comment. For me, working with my colleagues collaboratively, I just put so much more value in being able to sit face to face and work on things. And so as much as possible, I love encouraging young professionals to come into the office, be engaged, be part of that mentorship that you just can't quite do in a virtual fashion. And Caitlin's directly involved in our mentorship efforts here at Soderstrom.
Over the last few years, we've really pushed hard on our not just mentorship. We have now a more formal mentorship program in the office where we're pairing people, but that's part of a larger kind of equity approach. We recently got our JUST label through the International Living Future Institute. That's really focused on social responsibility internally within our office, a lot of equity programs there, but also how we interact with our community, our service to our community, and our relationships. So that's been a big push, and it's ongoing. It's definitely not over.
So I'm glad to know that you guys have some things in place to help the younger people. So personal or professional, how do you as an individual hope to make an impact on our world or your world? What is your personal world domination statement? Easy question to end the show.
Yeah, for sure. I struggle with this a bit. I think partly because to my personality, domination is not my approach usually. Like, how do I interpret this? And for me, it really comes back to those interpersonal relationships, leading with empathy, leading with understanding, and that's challenging. I don't always achieve that, but that is my goal. Rather than being reactive, taking things instantly and trying to respond, but really taking a step back. This, in personal relationships, as a parent, that's huge. And professionally, working with owners, working with contractors for sure, just being able to maintain those relationships. And I think ultimately the success of our projects is made or broken by our relationships that we've forged with the rest of the team and how we're able to successfully navigate problems that will inevitably come out.
I love that.
And, I think my mark on any of this, Cherise, by the way, I think you and I would work together well. In part, you said something earlier about how often you bring humor into your work, into your situations. I'm a firm believer that we can do our job and have some fun at it, be able to enjoy it. I don't think, there are going to be a lot of hard things we deal with. There'll be some really tough times, but there's no reason that we can't just bring joy and happiness into the process. I love that. I love what I do. I love coming to work. I love, as much as possible, interacting with the people that I work with a sense of happiness and joy. That's my goal. I'm just gonna keep putting it out there, and I'm gonna make it as enjoyable as possible to do the things that we do, and maybe other people will be affected by that. That's my hope.
Yeah, you're right. We'd get along great because I feel exactly the same way, and it is infectious.
Yeah.
You can come into a room, whether it's in your office or in your industry association or with your family or whoever. And just your approach can change the entire room.
Yeah.
I've done it. I've seen other people do it. And, everybody else is thinking, oh, this is going to be an issue. It's just like, hold my beer. Watch me turn this around. I might do something stupid like walk in a unicorn outfit. I've done some silly things in my different firms just to, remember we're humans and this isn't always an easy job, and it's not always riveting work either. There's a lot of creativity, but there's also a lot of, I'm a spec writer. There's a whole lot of writing technical documents. But I do this and doing this podcast is just rocks my world. I get to meet new, interesting, cool people every day. And, at the end of the day, our environment is directly affected by us, and we have complete control over that.
Yep.
If we're thoughtful about that, and it makes or breaks even tense situations.
Yeah.
So I love that answer. Wayne and Caitlin, I am so, so, so glad that you joined me today and talked about this great project that I will be visiting at some point. I will. When it opens, I'm heading out there. I'm due for a Walla Walla visit anyway. But I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to come talk to me about this. It was a fascinating interview, and I can't wait to share it with our listeners.
Thank you so much, Cherise. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate getting the chance to share our project with you.
Absolutely. It was great to chat with you, Cherise, and hope you can go out to Walla Walla very soon.